Welcome to this YSL Excel VBA tutorial. This video is going to explain how to use date fields and timelines in pivot tables. We'll start the video with a quick look at creating a pivot table and adding a date field to it so we have something to work with. Then look at a couple of the basic techniques such as grouping dates by multiple intervals of time and then sorting the dates in different ways as well. The biggest part of the video is going to focus on applying date filters, and we'll look at that first by applying filters to the underlying pivot field, which is the most powerful way to do it. But then we'll also move on and have a look at how you can create a timeline slicer, which gives you a slightly more visual, interesting way to apply simplistic date filters to a pivot table. One of the more powerful things about a timeline, though, is that it can apply to multiple different pivot tables at the same time. So the final part of the video is going to explain how you can control multiple pivot tables with the same single timeline. So let's get started. The starting point for this video is our usual Excel Movies workbook. If you don't already have a copy, there's a link in the video description you can use to download it. And when you do have a copy, the first thing we're going to do is write some code to generate a basic pivot table which will include our release date column. So let's head straight to the VB editor to get started with that, and we'll have a brand new module that we can write our first subroutine, create basic pivot. So no big surprises here with what we're about to do. We've created pivot tables in several of the previous videos. So let's have a quick variable which is going to hold a reference to our pivot cache object. And then we'll also have a variable to hold a worksheet, which is the worksheet on which our new pivot table will sit. And then finally we'll have a PT as pivot table variable, which will hold the pivot table itself. Setting up the pivot cache, just as usual, we're going to reference the cells on our movies worksheet. So I'm going to say set PC equals this workbook dot pivot caches dot create. Now there's a couple of parameters I'm going to fill in here, so let's just have a quick look. I'm going to set the source type parameter so that that's equal to an Excel database. So for internal Excel data we use Excel database, and then finally I'm going to set the source data parameter. So I'm going to refer to the cells on the movies worksheet containing data. To make this as dynamic and flexible as possible, I'm going to construct the cell references that I'm going to refer to. So I'm going to say wsmovies.name and then concatenate that with an exclamation mark, and then concatenate that with a reference to wsmovies dot range a1 dot current region, and then finally the address property of that block of cells. So exactly as we've done in previous videos, that will generate our basic pivot cache. Next we can add in our worksheet and then add a pivot table to it. So I can say set ws equals worksheets.add, and then I'm going to make sure I've got range A3 selected on that sheet, so I'm going to say range A3.select, and then I'm also going to make sure that I've renamed the worksheet so it's got a sensible name. So range A3.select, and then I'm going to say ws.name equals movie pivot. It's going to help us later on when we need to reference our pivot table and worksheet to have a sensible name, so that's why I'm doing that right now. Creating the pivot table itself, not too difficult. Again, we've done it in several previous videos. I can say set pt equals pc.createPivotTable. And again, there are several parameters I'm going to fill in. I'll make sure I give myself a space underscore. So table destination, first of all, is the compulsory one. So table destination is going to be equal to the cell that I've just selected. It's going to be the active cell. The table name, I don't need to fill this in, but again, just to help us later on when we need to reference the pivot table to do things with it, I'm going to say table name colon equals, and then again, I'm going to call this one movie pivot. And I'll spell that properly at some point. There we go. So there's the pivot table created and added to the worksheet. Finally, we can add a couple of basic fields to the pivot table. So let's say pt.addFields, and I'm going to add in some row fields first of all, or a row field, and the row fields are going to be equal to the release date column. So row fields equals release date. The column fields that I'm going to provide, column fields, is going to be simply the certificate column. So certificate. I'm going to add in a data field as well, just so that we've got some data to look at. And to do that, I'm going to say pt.addDataField, as usual. And again, there's a couple of parameters to fill in. The field, first of all, which is going to be equal to pt.pivotFields. And then I'm just going to use the standard one that I've been using for the previous few videos. I'm going to set this one equal to the runtime field. The function that I'd like to apply is going to be the average function, so I'm going to say function colon equals, and then Excel consolidation function dot Excel average. Last quick thing to do is just apply a quick bit of basic formatting. So I'm going to say pt.datafields, open parentheses, and refer to the first data field, which is the one that I've just added. Then set its number format property to be equal to 0.00. Okay, so at that point I'm just going to run the subroutine just to generate my basic pivot table on a new worksheet, and there it is. So what we'll look at now is how we can start modifying this date column, grouping, filtering, and applying timelines. The first thing we're going to look at doing to our date field is grouping it. So you can do this of course manually by right-clicking on a date cell and then choosing to group. You'll get a dialog box providing you with a range of different options for how you can group your data. So it allows you to choose a start date and an end date, and then an increment of time or multiple increments of time over which you can group these values. We're going to write some code that will achieve the same result. So let's just head back into the VB editor at this point and create a new subroutine that's going to be called grouping dates. I'm going to start then by creating a couple of variables that will give me references to both the worksheet and the pivot table I'm working with. So I'm going to declare a variable called ws as worksheet, and then I'm going to say dim pt as pivot table, and then I'm going to refer to the worksheet that I created in the previous subroutine. So I'm going to say set ws equals worksheets, then open some parentheses, and I call my worksheet movie pivot. This isn't necessary, it just makes life slightly more convenient when we're manipulating objects on the worksheet and the pivot table itself, of course. So the next thing I'm going to do is say set pt equals ws.pivottables, and then again I know that I've only got a single pivot table on the worksheet, so I could refer to it as pivot tables 1, but I also gave it a sensible name earlier on. I gave it the same name as the worksheet. So just to quickly cheat, I'm going to copy and paste movie pivot from the previous line. I'm also going to declare one final variable, and this is just going to give me a quick way to refer to the first date cell in the pivot table. So just having a quick look back at the pivot table date range, you can see that currently it starts in cell A5. Now that's purely because of where I placed the pivot table in the first place. Had I decided to place my pivot table somewhere else, of course, the first date would have a different cell reference. So what I'm going to do to set a reference to the first value in the date column is refer to the row range property of the pivot table. So I'm going to say dim r as range, and then once I've set a reference to the pivot table, I'm going to say set r equals pt dot row range. Now the row range really does refer to the entire range of row cells, so just to demonstrate that very quickly, if I said r.select and then just executed that subroutine and looked back at the Excel workbook, you'll see it selected everything from cell A4, so including the row heading, and then all the way down to the very, very last cell containing a date, all the way down somewhere here at the bottom, including the grand total row. I don't need to refer to that entire column of cells, I just need to refer to the first date value in there. So that's essentially the second cell in the row labels range. So if I go back to the VB editor, rather than setting R to be the row range completely, I'm going to set it to be equal to cells 2, 1 of the row range. So the cells property of course gives you the ability to reference cells by row and column index. So row 2, column 1. If I now just run that subroutine again, you'll find that when I look back at Excel, I've only got the first single date cell selected. Now I don't technically need to select that cell in order to group the dates. All I need to do instead is say r.group, and then there's a few parameters to fill in for this. Just as you saw in the dialog box that we've just looked at, you get the option to choose a start date and an end date, and then there is a range of different date periods we could select as well. So I'm just going to fill in the start and end properties first of all. So if I say start equals, now although I could specify an individual specific date here, it makes much more sense to just use the entire date range that my pivot table contains. And the simplest way to do that actually is just to miss out the start and end parameters completely. You can also set the start and end parameters to true, and that will include the full date range of the pivot table. So I'm going to do that for this example, start and end equals true. The next thing I have to do is set the periods over which I want to group. So for a date field, I can group by different units of time, different increments of time. Now the way this works is a little bit awkward. What I have to do is pass an array of 7 values, true and false Boolean values, that indicate whether or not I'm grouping by that particular increment of time. So to begin with, if I wanted to group by just the year, what I would have to do is pass an array containing 7 different true-false values where one of them is set to true. It's not very helpful at this point because it doesn't exactly tell you which one you need to set to true, but there is a way to find out. If you have a very quick look, there is a range.group method page, of course, as there is for every method available in VBA. So on the MSDN site, there is a little remark at the bottom there that shows you which value, which element in the array refers to which unit of time. So it's the very last one that refers to the years increment. So let's head back to the VB editor, and what I can do here is type in, sadly, kind of annoyingly, I can't even spell it properly, there we go, false. I'll need 6 falses followed by a single true, so I'm just going to copy and paste. There's my 6 falses followed by a true, then close the parentheses for the array function. So there we go, there's my full periods array set. So having done that, if I were to just run this subroutine at this point and switch back to Excel, you should see that this time, rather than showing the individual dates in my list, I've got everything grouped by year, so it should be a much shorter table than the one that I was showing you earlier on. If you can group rows, then it stands to reason that you should also be able to ungroup them, and indeed that's pretty straightforward to do. So if I just switch back to the VB editor and type in a simple statement that says r.ungroup. Appreciate that it's fairly redundant to group a set of rows and then immediately ungroup them, but just to demonstrate that this is the case, if I were to run that subroutine and then switch back to Excel, you'll see that I've now got individual dates again rather than grouped by years. You can also group by more than one interval of time. So let's say, for instance, I wanted to group by year and month. All I need to do to make that work is adjust the values of the array that I passed in. So switching back to the VB editor, if I can identify which of the falses equates to the months interval, I can set that to true. So again, just switching back to the page I showed you on the MSDN site, you'll find that months is the 5th element of the array, so it sits just before quarters in the sequence. So if I switch back to the VB editor again and change that 5th false to true, and then again I'm just going to comment out the r.ungroup statement just so we can see the end result. If I were to run that and have a look back at Excel, we'll see now I'm grouped by year and month. It's possible to sort items in the different groups as well, so it might be nice, just because of the data that I've got available, I've got more data for recent years than I have for older years. It might be nice to see the more recent years at the top. So I could sort by year in descending order, but I'd want to maintain an ascending order for the months inside each year. So to make that work, I've got to be able to reference the 2 columns or the 2 fields involved in the rows area there. So I've still got release date available, that's displayed there as the month names, and I've got the years field available, so that's been added in when I've grouped by years and months. So to make this work, if I switch back to the VB editor, and then I could just add in a couple of extra lines just below where I've grouped my data, I can reference a pivot field in my pivot table, so I can say pt.pivot fields, and then I can reference, first of all, let's go for the years column. If I refer to the years field first, and then I can apply an auto sort method to that. Now sadly the IntelliSense breaks down at this point. As you can see, I'm not getting any help here whatsoever. So if you wanted some help with that, what you could do instead is say dim pf as pivot field, declare a variable to hold a reference to it, get rid of the auto sort at the end there, and then I could say set pf equals pt.pivotfields years. The only advantage this gives me is that if I now say pf.autosort, you'll see that you get some IntelliSense and you get some help with the tooltips and gives you an idea about what things you can provide. So what I'm going to do first of all is set the order. Now the order I'd like for the years is in descending order, so I can say XL descending for that. And then I've also got to reference the name of the field that I'm applying the sort to. Even though I'm applying it to a pivot field that I've just referenced as years, I've also got to state the name of the field. So in this case, the name of the field is years. What I can then do is just copy and paste those 2 lines to essentially do the same thing for the release date field. So if I change this from years to release date, but in this case for release date, which is being displayed as the months still, I want to sort that in ascending order. So I just change the 2 names and then change the sort order to ascending rather than descending. Okay, so having just done that, if I would now run the subroutine and have a look at the results, back in Excel, I'll see that I've got more data to look at because my later years are at the top of the list, but I still maintain the ascending chronological order of months within each year. Another very useful thing you can do with dates is filter them. So looking at the drop-down list just at the top of the row labels column, if I click on the drop-down arrow there, of course I've got the standard type of filters where I can just select individual items. But it's also possible to use custom date filters. If I hover over the date filters item, there's a whole range of interesting things I can do here. So let's say, for instance, I wanted to see just the results for this year, or I wanted to see a date range, or all dates before, or all dates after. I can apply all these sorts of things in VBA. So let's switch back to the VB editor, and what we'll do is create a new subroutine somewhere down towards the bottom. So I'm going to call this one sub filter dates. Now, just as in the previous example, it's going to help immensely to have some variables to help us reference the various items. So let's just scroll back up to the previous routine and let's just cheat and copy and paste a whole range of variables. So we'll get all the variables and the two lines which set references to the worksheet and pivot table objects. We can then just head back down and paste those in. We're not going to need the range variable in this example, so I can remove that. But I will set the pivot field variable to reference the specific field in the pivot table called release date. So pt.pivot fields, and then open some parentheses and quotes, and refer to the release date field. Try and spell that properly, there we go. You can now apply filters directly to the field by saying pf.pivotFilters and then use the add or add to methods depending on which version of Excel you're working with. So add to, in my case, I'm in Excel 2013. So there are a few parameters you can fill in here, but just one really quick simple one. If I wanted to just see all the results for this year, I can set the type to be equal to, so I'm going to type in the word type, so type equals Excel date this year. You'll see all the date filters are kind of grouped together in a list here, so you'll be able to see with fairly sensible descriptions what each one is going to do. But as I say, in this case I wanted to say Excel date this year, so I'll select that one from the list, and then all I've got to do at this point is run the subroutine, and if I have a look back at Excel, I'll see that I'm now only looking at the data for the year 2016. Now if I wanted to apply a different filter to this dates column, I'd have to first of all remove the existing filter. So let's say, for example, I want to see all the dates that occurred in the month of June for any year of the entire list. If I switch back to the VB editor and I try to apply that immediately, so I'm going to change the filter type so it's Excel, all dates in period July. So that will choose all the dates in July regardless of which year they were in. If I attempt to run that at this point, it's going to fail because there's already a filter applied which conflicts with that one. So in order to make that one work, I'd have to first of all remove the filters or clear filters. I can clear filters in a couple of different ways. I can clear filters from the entire pivot table, which is kind of a catch-all kind of solution. So I can say pt.clear all filters. That will remove everything from the entire table. I could also choose to remove a specific individual filter from my pivot field. So I could say pf.pivotFilters and then refer to the first filter I'd applied and then say .delete. So that would delete just a single individual filter. Alternatively, I could just clear all the filters from that single individual pivot field. So I could say pf.clear all filters, and that's the technique I'm going to go with. So I'm just going to delete the previous two, which delete all the other filters, and then run this subroutine one more time, and this time I'll have a look back and I'll see that I've only got July, but for every single year in the list. You can create more flexible filters by applying specific criteria. So let's say, for instance, I want to see all the films released since the year 2000, so since the 1st of January 2000. That means I'd have to reference all the dates after the 31st of December 1999. So to make that work, what I can do is head back into the VB editor. I'm going to change the type of filter I'm applying, so it's not Excel all dates in the period July, it's Excel after. Now it kind of stands to reason that if you're specifying after a date, you'll also need to pass in the date you're interested in. So if I type in a comma to redisplay the tooltip, I can do that by specifying the value1 parameter. So I say value1 equals. Now the simple way to pass dates in is as a string of text, but do be careful with this, it's kind of dependent on the regional settings of your machine. So working on a UK-based machine with UK regional settings, I'm going to enter my date as 31/12/19 and 99. So if you're in a different region where you do it in a funny way, where you've got the month first followed by the day, make sure you do it that way for your particular region. Anyway, having done that, if I were to just run that subroutine at that point and have a quick look back at the VB editor, I'll see that I've got dates sorted for all the years since the year 2000, so anything before the year 2000 won't be included in the range. You can also ask to display dates within a certain range by specifying a start date and an end date. So in order to make that work, if I switch back to the VB editor, of course I'll need to modify the type of filter first of all. So I'm going to say, rather than XL after, it's going to be XL date between. Let's go for the year 1999 then, I guess. Let's see all the films made in the year 1999. So value 1 is going to have to be the start date of 1999, so that's 0101, and then value 2, which is another parameter in the add to method, I can say value 2 : equals, then again entering as a string of text, I can say 31/12/1999. So having done that, if I were to run that subroutine and then have a quick look, I'll see that I've got everything in that specific year. Rather than hard coding the date range you want, it's also possible to calculate the dates, which allows you to create slightly more dynamic filters. So let's say, for instance, whenever I built my pivot table, I always wanted it to show the last 6 months worth of results, for example. So in order to make that work, I'd have to calculate the start date and end date by saying the end date would be today's date, and the start date would be 6 months ago from today's date. So to make that work, if I switch back to the VB editor, just to make this a little bit easier to read, I'm going to separate these parameters onto different lines. The end date is fairly straightforward. You can just use a function which returns today's date, and in VBA, the name of that function is simply called date. If I wanted to calculate what the date was 6 months ago from today's date, then to do that I can use another function for the value 1 parameter called date add. So if I write the date add function, I've got 3 parameters to fill in: the interval, the number of those intervals, and the date to which I want to add or subtract that number of intervals. Now the intervals you pass in here are entered as strings, and again there's a help page on the MSDN site that helps to explain what the various intervals are. So if I wanted to go back years, I'd enter 4 Ys. If I want to go back months, I enter a single M as a string. So back in the VB editor, if I type in a single M in double quotes, the number that I want to add, or subtract in this case, is -6, and then the date to which I want to add or subtract that number is today's date, so I can use my date function again. If I just close the parentheses at that point, I can now run that subroutine again and have a look back at the results, and what I'm looking at here is all the films, or all the data for films released in the last 6 months. So there's not much there actually, as it turns out. There's only 1 in this particular example. So depending on which date you run this code, you may find that you don't return anything at all. So it might make more sense, just for the sake of demonstration, if you switch back to the VB editor, say let's go back a couple of years perhaps. So I change the increment to 2 years, let's go back 2 years, and then run that subroutine again. Switch back to the VB editor, now I've got the last 2 years worth of data. Another way to filter dates in a pivot table is to use something called a timeline. Now a timeline is just really a fancy type of slicer that works with date values. You can insert them manually if you have a cell in your pivot table selected. From the Analyze tab in the ribbon, you can choose to insert a timeline, so it's just another kind of slicer. Of course you can do it manually, but I'm going to write some code to do this just to demonstrate how that works. If you followed the video on inserting slicers, the previous video that I made, then you'll be right at home with how timelines work, at least how you set them up in the first place. So let's just start by removing all the filters. I'll do this manually just very quickly and easily by clicking on the drop down arrow at the top of the row labels box and choose clear filter from years. Then I'm going to head back to the VB editor and we're going to create a new subroutine that's going to add in our timeline. So let's create a new sub called create timeline. Just as before, we'll find it useful to have a few variables to hold references to objects, so switching back up to the previous routine, I'm going to copy all the variables I declared, plus the setWS and setPT lines. We're going to paste that back in. I'm not going to need my PF variable, so I'm going to replace it with a couple of extra variables. One called SC, which holds a reference to something called a slicer cache, which is kind of the equivalent of a pivot cache, but for a slicer, so it's the bit that does the hard work with all the filters. The actual visual object, the physical thing the user can interact with, is simply called a slicer, so I'm going to declare SL as a slicer. I've got my references to my worksheet and pivot table, so what I'm going to do next is create my new slicer cache by saying set sc equals this workbook dot slicer caches dot add, or add to in this case for this particular version of Excel. If I open up some parentheses, there's a few different parameters to fill in. Now you might remember from the previous video, if you use named parameters for this method when you're adding a slicer cache, for some bizarre reason the whole thing falls over. So unlike every other example where I've been naming parameters for methods, which I always like to do because I think it makes the code much more readable, you can't do it for this particular method. It just makes the whole thing fall over. I have no idea why. I guess Microsoft called that a feature, but there we go. So without naming these parameters, I'm going to set the source to be equal to my PT, so my pivot table. So if I reference a pivot table, the slicer cache will actually use the pivot cache of that pivot table to generate the slicer cache. The second thing I need to do is set the source field, so that's fairly nice and easy. If I remember to add in the continuation character, space underscore. So the release date field is the one we're going to use here, of course. Then we can give the slicer cache a name, and that's going to help us again later on when we need to reference it again. So I'm going to give my slicer cache a name. I'm going to call it date slicer cache, and I can reference that name later. And then finally I can change the slicer cache type. Now there are two possibilities here. If I look for the XL slicer cache type enumeration, there are two options. So for a normal slicer, of course, you'd use XL slicer, but for a timeline, we'll use XL timeline. So I'll select XL timeline and then close the parentheses, and that will create my slicer cache. One little thing to watch out for when you're adding slicer caches is that if one already exists for the field you've selected, then this line of code is going to fail. So just to demonstrate that, if I run this one once, it works happily. If I try to run it again immediately, it fails because the slicer cache already exists. So it's worthwhile having a quick little bit of error handling to ensure that the slicer cache on that particular field doesn't yet exist. So what I'm going to do is just at the top, I'm going to try to delete the slicer cache first. So I'm going to say this workbook dot slicer caches, and then because I've referenced it with a specific name, I can say date slicer cache, and then I can just attempt to delete it. Now of course this will work in this particular case. If I run this one this time, it will work every single time. But if that slicer cache hadn't existed in the first place, this line of code would have failed. So it's worthwhile having a simple little bit of error handling to say on error resume next, which will just ignore the error if one occurs on this line. And then after that we can say on error go to 0, which just resets all the error handlers. We do have a separate video which goes into much more detail on error handling in VBA that's part of this main VBA tutorial series, so feel free to have a look at that one if you want a bit more detail on what that does. But again, if I can run this one again as many times as I like now, neither of these two things will crash because it deletes the slicer cache and then creates a new one from scratch. So the next thing to do then is actually create the slicer. So if I were to set SL to be equal to sc.slicers.add. Now there are a few parameters to fill in. Again, the named parameters don't work for this particular method. So the slicer destination, that's fairly simple. The slicer destination is the worksheet that I've referenced up here earlier on. So I can say WS. The other parameters I wanted to fill in, well, first of all, I'm going to skip over the level parameter. That's not particularly important for this particular case. That's only for cube sources for pivot tables. So I can skip over the level parameter by typing in 2 commas actually after the WS. This is why it's so frustrating not to be able to name the parameters. I could have actually named the parameters and specified them exactly rather than typing in these multiple commas. Anyway, the name of my slicer is going to be called something really simple like date slicer, so again I can reference that later on. Then the caption, I can set that to be something like select date range or something along those lines. And then I'm not going to specify the top left width or height properties for the slicer at this point. I'm going to set those separately just in a moment once we've created the actual original slicer. So if I can just get you to run that subroutine at that point, have a quick look back at the Excel workbook, we'll now see we've got a new slicer with the ability to choose dates. It's probably worthwhile mentioning how you can get rid of slicers if you want to remove them. So one simple way to do that is actually just to delete the slicer cache in the first place. If I switch back to the VB editor and then just use the F8 key to step through this subroutine, if I step through the part up to where I delete the slicer cache and then just stop running the subroutine at that point, have a look back at the Excel workbook, you'll see the slicer itself has gone. It's also possible to delete the slicers individually from the pivot table. If I switch back to the VB editor, I could create a separate subroutine that would do this. So I could say delete slicers from pivot. So to make that work, I'll start with a couple of variables again. So in fact, I'm just going to copy and paste variables from the previous routine. And then if I paste those into this new subroutine, I can get rid of the slicer cache variable. I shan't need that one. I've got references to the worksheet and the pivot table. What I could do then is just loop over the slicers collection of the pivot table. So I could say for each SL in pt.slicers, and then say next SL. And then inside that loop I could simply say sl.delete. So again, if I were to run the original subroutine, which will create the slicer or the timeline in the first place, and there it sits, go back to the VB editor and then run this subroutine, I'll find that the slicer has now disappeared. So I do actually want to create this slicer though, so I want to modify something about it. So I just click back into the create timeline subroutine and then just run that one more time to make sure that the slicer does actually exist. There are several different things you can do to modify the appearance of the timeline and both its size and position as well. So just to demonstrate how that works, if I switch back into the VB editor, let's have a new subroutine down at the bottom of the module, which is going to be called something simple like format timeline. And then I'm going to copy and paste the declarations of my variables and the two set statements from the previous routine. I'm also going to add in a separate set statement that's going to say set sl equals pt.slicers, and then I can refer to my slicer as a date slicer. That's the name that I gave it earlier on. Having referenced that, I've got a few different things that I can do. So just very quickly, I could change the position of the slicer. I can set its top and left properties. So if I say sl.top, this lets me set the distance from the top of the screen to the top of, the top of the worksheet to the top of the slicer. So I could set it to be an absolute position, like for instance 100 points, or I could refer to a range of the pivot table. So it's nice to be able to say here pt.table range 1, again I mentioned this in previous videos, but table range 1 is the range of the pivot table except for the page fields at the top. So if I say table range 1.top, that will position the slicer and timeline at the exact same level as the top of the pivot table. I could change its left property so that it's just sitting to the right hand side of my pivot table, so I could say sl.left equals, and I could set this to be equal to pt.tablerange1.left plus pt.tablerange1.width plus a tiny little buffer of, let's say, 20 points or so. Finally, I'm going to just change the width of my timeline. I'm not going to change its height. The height is reasonably good already, so I'm going to say sl.width and make that equal to something like 500 points or so. Having done that, if I were to just run this subroutine and then have a look back at the workbook, I'll see that my timeline is now moved, so it sits up at the top level of the pivot table, just to the right of the pivot table, and it's a little bit wider, so it's slightly easier to use as well. The formatting options for timelines are pretty much just as limited as they are for slicers, so if you remember from the previous video, you can apply styles to a slicer or a timeline. If I switch to the Options tab, having selected the timeline, there's a bunch of basic timeline styles. Now all they really do is just change the colours, so you can easily see that they change the colours of the various elements of the slicer. It's virtually not worthwhile doing, but if I wanted to apply one of these styles in code, I could do that. So the names of these are kind of almost the same as the names shown on the tooltips if you hover the mouse over it. They're slightly different. So if I just switch back to the VB editor, I can say sl.style equals, and I've got to type in the name of the timeline style, but without spaces. So it's time slicer style. So it's not timeline style, it's time slicer style. Then I can apply, let's go for dark 6, for instance. Then if I were to run that subroutine, have a look at the results, I've got this fairly horrible shade of green. Let's go for a slightly different one. If I change it to style light 5 and then try that one again, have a quick look, I've got a slightly different style applied. One slightly more useful thing you can do with the timeline is change the unit of time that it's defaulted to. So here I'm looking at the months increment for this particular timeline, which means if I click on an individual component there, it filters for a single specific month. Of course, I can extend that range across multiple months if I want to by clicking and dragging, or even just remove the filter altogether. We'll do this in code in just a moment, but sometimes it's useful to be able to see different increments of time. So with the months option up here, I can change it to years, quarters, or days instead. So all that does is changes what will be filtered when I select a different item in the timeline. So if I wanted to modify that myself, so if I wanted to switch from months to years, say, let's switch back to the VB editor, and as well as saying sl.style, I can say sl.timelineViewState.level, and I can make that equal to 4 of the different increments of time as we've just seen there in the drop-down list. So it's currently in months. If I want to set it to years, I can just add that line of code and then run the subroutine again, switch back to Excel, and you'll see that it's defaulted to years rather than months. So it's relatively easy to switch between those different increments of time. Now, of course, the whole point of having a timeline is that it allows you or the end user to filter the pivot table in a sort of nice visual way. So you can click on individual elements and click and drag to span a range of months or years or whatever range of values you've got selected on the timeline. What I'd like to do here is show you how you can do that in code. So of course you can do all this sort of stuff by just applying filters to the actual pivot table field, but you can also do it with the slices. So let's have a look at how you can do that. If I switch back to the VB editor, let's have a new subroutine which is called something like filter dates with timeline. And what we're actually going to be doing here is we're going to be using the slicer cache rather than the slicer object itself. So if I say dim sc as slicer cache, then I can set sc to be equal to this workbook dot slicer caches, and because I gave my slicer cache a sensible name earlier on, I can reference it as date slicer cache. So that will give me a reference to the object, and now I can now start to apply filters to it. Now the filters you can add using a timeline are somewhat less sophisticated than those you can add just by using the underlying pivot table field, but nonetheless it's still worthwhile seeing what you can do. So if I say sc.timelineState.set filter date range, you'll see that you've got a start date and an end date parameter, and that's basically it. A timeline allows you to filter for a specific date range, but you can't use any of the more sophisticated types like we saw earlier on for the date filters. Still, we can apply a start date and an end date by typing in those parameter names. So I'm going to say start date colon equals, not necessary, but as I said before, I always like to do this. And again, the start date and end date can be entered just as literal strings. So let's just say, for instance, 01/01/2000 for this example. And then I'll set the end date so that that's equal to the last day of that year as well. So I'm going to say 31/12/2000. Again, making sure that's in the particular format for the region you're in. So if I were just to run that subroutine at that point, have a look back at the movies workbook, you'll see that I'm filtered just for the year 2000, and that's what it's shown selected there. If I change the increment of time there in the slicer or the timeline, just to show you that it's that it is the entire range, so January through to December. Oops, going a little bit too far. Scroll back quickly. There we go. So January through to December for the year 2000. If I wanted to clear any filters from my timeline, that's pretty straightforward too. So if I switch back and I wanted to just clear all the filters from the slicer cache, I can say sc.clear all filters, just the same sort of technique used for pivot tables earlier on. So if I run that subroutine again, let's look back at the at Excel, I'll see that I've got all the data back. Again, let's just switch back to years to make that simpler to see. You can still use the more dynamic technique for setting the date range as we looked at earlier on, so just switching back to the VB editor to do that, we can set the end date so that that's equal to today's date, and then I can set the start date. So let's go back, let's say 3 years back from today's date. So I say date, add, open some parentheses, and say the interval will be in years. Then the number I want to add is -3, and the date to which I want to add those years is today's date. If I just make sure that I've commented out the clear all filters statement and then just run that subroutine again, looking back at Excel, you'll see that I've indeed got those 3 years selected. Again, you can see clearly that it's actually got this specific date range here, December the 7th, 2013 to December 7th, 2016. So it's not just the entirety of 2014. Just try to indicate that there on the slice. It's not got the entirety of 2013 selected. Let's just clear all the filters then from that particular timeline, and then let's have a look at one more useful, interesting thing you can do with timelines that you can't do with basic filters in a pivot table. So all we've really seen for timelines so far is that they're a slightly more awkward and less powerful way to filter dates in a single pivot table, but they do have one trick up their sleeve that you can't apply using basic filters in a single table. A timeline can be connected to multiple tables at the same time, so for dashboarding type effects it's great for being able to control the filters for multiple tables all at once, just like for slicers. So what we're going to do is write another subroutine quickly that's going to generate a new pivot table that's going to sit somewhere around cell, let's say cell J12. Here, and it's going to have a slightly different arrangement to this pivot table, but it's going to be connected eventually to this same slicer and will be filtered at the same time. So to do that, let's switch back to the VB editor, and to start with, what we can do is head right back to the very top of this module and just copy the entire subroutine that we created right at the very start to generate a pivot table. If I just paste that in now down at the bottom, I can say create new pivot, and then we'll need to make a few modifications to the way this code works just to set up the new table. I'm just going to modify the code for the worksheet first of all. So rather than creating a new sheet, I'm going to reference one that already exists. So I called the worksheet movie pivot earlier on, so I can reference that existing sheet. Then I don't want to select range A3, I said I wanted to select something like J12. I don't then need to change the name of the worksheet, so that line can be removed entirely, it's already got a name. What I can then do is change the way that I'm setting my pivot cache variable. So I'm just going to take that entire section of code out for the moment and then just paste it in down below once I've set my worksheet variable. I don't want to create a new pivot cache at all. What I want to be able to do is set my pivot cache variable to refer to the pivot cache of the existing pivot table on this worksheet. So I'm going to say ws.pivottables, and then I gave my pivot table a sensible name earlier on. I called it movie pivot. And then I can refer to the pivot cache property of that pivot table. So pivot cache will return the pivot cache on which that table is based. As this new pivot table is of course going to be based on exactly the same set of data, there's no reason whatsoever to create a separate pivot cache for that. So I've then got the ability to create a new pivot table using the pivot cache. I'm going to give it a slightly more interesting name. I'm going to call it movie pivot 1. I'll need to reference that name again shortly. And then let's change the fields that we add into the pivot table. So let's change it from release date in the row fields box. I'm going to change that so it's the genre column in the row fields, and we'll stick with certificate in the column fields. We'll stick with runtime for the data field with the same number formatting. So at that point all I'm going to do is run that subroutine to create a second pivot table on the same sheet that currently isn't connected to this slicer or timeline. You can see that if I select items in this timeline at this point, it's not affecting anything on the second pivot table. So the next job is to connect this second pivot table into the timeline. So let's head back to the VBA editor to do this, and we'll have another new subroutine just somewhere down below. We'll call this one sub connect timeline to pivots, something along those lines. We'll have a few different variables here. I'm going to have a variable for a worksheet, a pivot table, and a slicer cache. So just to quickly copy and paste those three variables from the previous routine, I'm going to change the names of one of them, so it's not PC, it's SC, and it's not pivot cache, it's slicer cache instead. So I've got my worksheet and pivot table variables. I'm going to set my worksheet and pivot table variables to refer to the same objects I've been referencing previously, so scrolling back up to reference my movie pivot objects from earlier on. I can copy and paste those two lines, and rather than referencing movie pivot, I'm going to reference movie pivot 1, so the new one that I've just created. I can then set my slicer cache to be equal to this workbook dot slicer caches, and then in some parentheses I've called it date slicer cache. I could also reference it as the number 1, as it's the only only slicer cache that I've created in this workbook. All I need to do now is say sc.pivottables, so each slicer cache has a collection of pivot tables to which it's connected, and then I can say .add, and then reference the pivot table that I want to add into it. So I can just say PT, as I've just referenced it. It might be worthwhile just very quickly applying a filter to that, so again I can just copy and paste from a previous subroutine, one which filters it for the previous 3 years. So if I copy and paste that line and then simply run that subroutine one more time, have a look back at Excel, and you'll see hopefully this time that the second table is now being affected by the slicer or the timeline. If I change the timeline, it will affect both tables, as you can clearly see. So that's one nice feature of timelines, although they're a little bit more limited in terms of what they can do in terms of date filtering. They can be connected to multiple different tables and control them all at the same time. So hope you found that video useful. Thanks for watching. See you next time. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the WiseL website, where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching. See you next time.